Hi, I'm Rob Dietz.
I'm Asher Miller.
And I'm Jason Bradford. Welcome to Crazy Town, where Jim Jones, Alex Jones, and the Jonas Brothers all got their best ideas.
The topic of today's episode is positive feedback loops, and please stay tuned for an interview with Beth Sawin.
Hey, Jason and Rob, have you guys ever been in a situation where you feel like things just got amplified? So it started small and then kind of went out of control all of a sudden, and you're like, what the hell happened?
Yeah. I mean, unlike most Disney characters, I grew up in a family with, I had an older sister. Fights always amplified, went out of control.
Well, that's actually why I bring this up, because I just had this dynamic. You know, my family's been largely stuck at home for the last year plus, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Nerves getting frayed, getting annoyed with each other. And my youngest son was upset by something. He started yelling. That got me all uptight. So I started yelling, then my wife gets upset. And then
Did she start yelling?
She actually didn't start yelling, but the dog just got upset. He started yelling, So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just something that felt like, holy shit, this is getting out of control all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I can think of situations where I've gone into a restaurant and it's been, fairly nice. The tables aren't full, and you sit it down, you start having a meal, and then, maybe you get there around 6 p.m., but by 6:30, the place is packed, and you find you have to kind of start yelling across the table to be heard. But of course, that means that the table next to you, they have to yell to be heard.
Right.
And there's just this din, and you just realize, oh my gosh, it's just nuts in here. I can barely hear myself think anymore.
And pretty soon your vocal cords are wasted and you can't speak at all.
Well, I get out my loudspeaker, right?
Right.
My megaphone.
You got to outcompete everybody else.
I don't like going to restaurants with you, Jason, when you rip out that megaphone and start shouting at me. It's just not pleasant.
Yeah. Well, it makes everyone else shut up.
He likes to do it in an empty restaurant.
Right.
He's just preempt it all, right?
Yeah.
Well, that reminded me of something I once saw on the mean streets of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love.
Yeah.
City of Rocky Balboa.
Yeah, so I lived there. There's a kind of a famous night spot on South Street where all the bars and stuff are, and I was walking there one night, and these two guys started kind of getting in each other's mugs, and as happens in Philadelphia, one of them probably said to the other, "Ugh," and then the other guy was like, "Hey," and the other guy was like, "Hey!"
And you started throwing batteries at each other?
Well, right, like the football fans. But
Over my head, but I guess that happened.
yeah, no, a famous game where the fans in Philadelphia are like throwing batteries on the field at the opposing team.
I think there's another one where they're throwing snowballs at Santa.
Right.
Just pelting Santa with snowballs.
Yeah, brotherly love. So these two guys, they start escalating, almost like your restaurant scene, Jason. They're like getting louder and more in each other's face. And I'm like kind of clearing back, waiting for an MMA fight to break out. And the only thing that saved, or maybe I shouldn't say saved because it would have been interesting, I guess, to see this. But the most mammoth policeman I've ever seen just kind of like steps out of a doorway. This guy was like 6'8" and did not look thin and tall. I mean, he was just like a huge mountain of a man. And he just walks up behind one of the guys, puts his hands on his hips, and the two guys kind of look, they eyeball, and they just walked away. They just went separate ways. I was like, what a great regulation of that fight.
Yeah.
That's interesting that you bring that up. The reason I was thinking about this or wanted to bring it up was because that whole dynamic that happened with my family made me think about positive feedback loops.
Yeah.
You guys familiar with that concept?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about positive feedback loops as one of the hidden drivers for us to explore in this season of Crazy Town. With hidden drivers this season, we're just talking about things that may be below the radar, factors, drivers that are pushing us into Crazy Town, where we're consuming too much. Too many of us are consuming too many things, and we're not solving our problems in a rational way.
Yeah, and it feels like there's this collective action problem, like the restaurant example, where no one planned to just talk louder. It just emerged because you had to, and then you had to, and
right.
So yeah, it's it can be kind of crazy making in that you lose control in a sense. It runs away from you.
Well, the three of us have done some studying and research in systems dynamics and in the idea of feedback loops. I'm wondering, for those listening, if we could just step it back a bit and kind of define what we're talking about here with like positive feedback loops. And
yeah, I think one of the challenges is that the language is a little confusing. Terminology is a little confusing, right? So I think a lot of people, when they think about a positive feedback loop, they think about something that has a positive outcome, right? And actually,
it's a happy feedback loop.
Right. And a negative feedback loop is something that has a negative outcome.
Sad.
It's actually not that. So a positive feedback loop is something that is self-reinforcing. Right. So you have a situation where there's a factor that gets amplified, and that leads to another factor getting amplified.
Like Jason's megaphone.
Exactly.
Or I'll punch you, and you're going to punch me back harder.
Yeah,
exactly.
Or punch me back with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
So the positive feedback loop is also known as a self-reinforcing feedback. And a negative feedback loop is a self-regulating, right? So you think about a positive feedback loop, it's amplifying, it's making something bigger, it's extending it, whether that thing is a positive thing or a negative thing. That's a positive feedback loop.
Whether it's positive in the sense of we think of it as good.
Good, okay. Right. Good or bad.
Yeah. Well, why don't we give some examples then of the negative feedback loop? Because we gave some good examples of positive feedback loops.
Yeah. Well, the easiest one that I think gets brought up when you're looking into systems and how they work is a thermostat. So, if you're heating your house, you set the thermostat to I guess
I always do 88 degrees.
I was going to say, this is luxury America. We set it to, a nice balmy 80. So you set it to whatever. As the temperature warms up, there's a device in there that's recognizing it, and it says, okay, turn off the heat when it gets to a certain level. So that's one of the regulating.
And then if it drops too low, it'll turn it back on.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. There's some really interesting stuff related to like steam engines. So
wow, take us back, Mr. Steampunk.
Because if you think of they're called governors, right?
Hello, governor, like that,
right? But
it's a little man in a top hat with a cane.
But basically, when you have, you could get a runaway combustion of these engines, where the engine just, if you open up the throttle, more fuel, more air, and the explosion gets bigger and bigger. So how do you keep it damped down? Well, of course, as steam engines go, they start spinning, right? They mechanical energy. And these governors, what they did, they had this ingenious mechanism where they actually had weighted balls. They had like balls on hinges.
Don't make a joke here, Ron. Okay.
I know when to be quiet, okay?
But these things would be spinning, and as they spun, they would rise. And of course, as the balls would kind of rise up, the force of gravity would push them down harder, proportional to their angle. So that kind of kept these valves from opening too far and regulated the injection of fuel and air into the engine. So again, another way of a negative loop on the throttle.
Some people actually wish that the governor they elected was a ball on a hinge instead of the actual politician. But that's neither here nor there. These are really good examples, and we can provide a lot more. And I'm sure later we'll talk about some other examples. But for listeners, if you're interested, there's an entire field that is devoted to the idea of systems and how they're regulated, and it includes both mechanical, machinery type stuff and biological, living organisms, and that's called cybernetics. So if you want to do the deep dive,
and they apply that even to like physiology. So they say cybernetics can apply to biological systems where your heart rate is regulated. There's all these feedback loops that go into that.
Yeah, I think it's just important to recognize that we have a lot of these feedback loops, negative and positive ones, in nature and biological systems, but we've also incorporated them a lot into mechanical systems that we've created. We've also done it with human behavior. So there's things like, if we're talking again about negative feedback loops or ones that are around, regulating, there things have been done in terms of adjusting behavior with very small methods. So an example of that might be, you guys been driving down a road and there's a sign that tells you what your speed is.
Yeah, but I can't drive 55 though.
No.
I can't drive 55.
You just ignore it, right?
Yeah.
Well, the reason that those things are up is that they actually are really good at tamping down people's speeds.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
so it's regulating.
Wait a second.
That does the opposite for you?
Yeah, I thought those things were making fun of how slow I was going. So I just always jam the accelerator when I see that sign.
You're the outlier. I think they've done studies and they found that something like 15%, reduce their speed to below. And it actually has a lasting impact.
Yeah.
Not just they go by that sign, they're like, floor it now.
No, I agree. They actually are really effective. In fact, now that you can get all the navigation from your phone on a screen in a car, often it puts the speed limit up there. And that's it always makes me kind of, okay, I better stick to that.
Yeah.
My wife is much better at paying attention to those. I'm driving with her, and she's like, it's 35 here, right? I'm like, okay. So she's like a double regulator.
Double regulator. I'm sure that's what she wants to be known as.
That's why Jason calls his wife Governor.
Hello, Governor. Every time she gets in the car with you. Well, so those are negative feedback loops. I want to talk about positive feedback loops.
Yeah, I'm wondering, since you're bringing it up as a hidden driver, I think it'd be fun to riff on. Let's see if we can name and describe a whole bunch of these things.
Sure. Well, let's start with a simple one that back in the days when there actually was an interest rate that was above zero,
right.
that actually people could relate to, and that is, if you put money in a savings account and it's accruing interest of some kind, right? Then you have more money, and then you invest more of that money. You get more interest, right? Yeah. So it just builds on itself.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, me and my friend, we used to think about, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And our answer was, well, if we can somehow get $1 million and then we just put it in a bank and we'll be interest collectors.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that was our grand scheme.
But actually what you're pointing to is a major dynamic in growing inequality, in the world, where people who have capital are able to invest it, and that money just keeps growing. And if you don't have anything to invest to begin with, you just never get ahead. So that gap keeps extending.
Or if you're late to the game, right? Like, let's say you do like Jason's route and you go get a PhD where you're not earning anything for half of your life. And then you got to start investing when you're already an old man.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why you got into the drug trade. You got to take some more risks.
Yeah.
Right.
So just, let me know what you need.
Well, that's a good classic example, but I want to go back to the can of worms that you opened at the beginning, which is more the way people tend to escalate each other in a positive feedback loop. And since I'm in the kind of the pop culture sphere in this podcast, let's talk about sports, all right? My favorite positive feedback loop is when if you're watching a baseball game, it's sorry, Jason, I know you're a fan, and you too, Asher. To me, it's the most boring sport there is, really.
Most boring?
Well,
you say it's more boring than golf.
No, because golf is not a sport. We've already established this.
More boring than soccer.
Soccer is awesome. Don't even make... Oh, man.
I knew how
now we're escalating. This is a positive feedback.
Do you know how many listeners we just lost when you insulted golf?
Yeah.
3. I think
I know.
3. We
Really?
lost 3.
Any? But this is when baseball actually gets exciting.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so you're sitting there watching a game, and some awesome hitter just cranks a home run, which is obviously the most
highlight.
Yeah, like that's a highlight. But then he does some display, like flips his bat the wrong way, or like pounds his chest as and slowly circles the bases.
Right. Yeah.
So
rubs it in.
It's basically like saying I just crushed your team. So the next time that guy comes up, the pitcher is like, well, this will not stand.
Right.
So the pitcher throws this like really high and tight fastball and knocks the guy down. Then the next escalation is that guy gets up and stares down the pitcher, points at him, kind of making faces. So then the pitcher just hits him.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the guy like thinks about charging the mound, but he doesn't. He just goes to first base. But the next inning, for revenge, the pitcher on the other team beans some dude. Right. And so at that point, it's too late. He just charges the mound.
Yeah.
bench empties, this bench empties. It just
and we
positive.
have an ESPN highlight reel.
Yeah. That's the best part of baseball right there. But it's a total positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And then you start getting the fans going after each other in the stands, and then it like breaks out. There's actually civil war happening. There are people like rushing out of Boston and New York, or they're meeting somewhere halfway.
You better hope it's not in Philadelphia.
Right.
Well,
they'll be ready with the batteries.
My most memorable baseball experience actually has to do with one of these things where Reggie Smith playing for the Dodgers was in Candlestick Park, which is the Giants' old stadium.
Reggie Smith. I don't remember this.
In 1981, he was a famous guy.
That's a long time ago.
He hit over 300 homers in his career. But Reggie Smith is getting heckled by a Giants fan above the Dodgers dugout. And I was just behind there. And I'm watching this happen. And Reggie Smith is looking up and pointing at him. And I can tell there's something going on. By like inning 7, Reggie Smith goes up into the stands and starts beating up on the guy. You can look it up. It's on the Wikipedia page about Reggie Smith.
Positive feedback loop.
Positive feedback loop. It's awesome.
It's a perfect example of how positive feedback loops can actually not be positive.
I don't know.
Getting your face beat by a baseball player.
Depends how obnoxious that fan was.
Well, it's not positive for him.
He was arrested.
Yeah, not good.
Well, positive feedback loops, another good example of how they can be both positive and negative in consequence, has to do with, example I like to think about is soil dynamics. So you can degrade soil, so you can make soil worse. Like let's say you put in a housing development, Rob, and you decide you're going to strip off all the topsoil.
As I normally do.
Yeah. And you strip all the topsoil because you're going to sell the topsoil. Yeah. And so you just leave this sort of like lifeless subsoil. And then the homeowner comes in and tries to put a garden in, and their plants are less like, So
is that what plants do?
Yeah.
That for our listeners is the sound of a plant not growing.
Right. And so the plants can't grow, and so the rain starts coming in and hitting the soil and making mud piles, and the soil gets more compacted. It gets worse and worse because you've destroyed that soil fertility, and now it can't recover easily, right?
Yeah.
So that's a positive feedback loop, but obviously that's not desirable, except you made a lot of money as a developer.
Oh, yeah, it's totally desirable there after I scraped that soil and sold it.
Well, it just doesn't matter to you at that point.
But you could actually run that, like I think this is where you're getting to. You could run that in reverse, right? Like
Sure.
You could have soil regeneration that's a lot of what you're all about in your career as a farmer, right? Is trying to build healthy soil.
Yeah, so instead, let's say you put a bunch of compost onto that degraded soil, suddenly it can grow plants really well. And then the next thing you know, that's a self-reinforcing positive feedback that is regenerating a good, healthy soil profile.
You remember our listener, Don, who told us to play our podcast over his farm field?
Right.
So he's basically equating our
with
podcast to compost.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, well, while we're in the realm of nature, I want to point out a positive feedback loop that I became kind of intimately aware of when I was working in the desert Southwest. I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and most of the wildlife refuges have to do with water. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a historical link with ducks, waterfowl, and so a lot of your national wildlife refuges are in these low-lying places. So in the desert Southwest, if you go like in places along the Rio Grande or the Colorado River, you'll find refuges, and they're all covered with tamarisk. With salt cedar is another name for it, but it's an invasive species that was brought over to try to stabilize riverbanks. A lot of those rivers in the desert, they have low flow most of the year, but during the snow melt season, you have these huge pulses of water that come in.
Yeah.
And so what the tamarisk does, once you establish it, they have these huge tap roots that go way down, and they suck up all the water, and then basically no other plants can reach the water table. So they alter the habitat in a way that then makes it more ready for other tamarisk to come in and colonize. So it just keeps adding more and more of this invasive species, and you can't really do anything about it other than if you have a way to change back to the native flood regime.
But then the banks of the river are totally solid, right? Because there's no water anymore.
Well, it's insane. Like if you see a tamarisk gallery forest. Like, you can't get through it.
No, it's
it's
amazing.
so thick.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's native to like Central Asia. Iran has a huge amount. And so, yeah, it's fascinating. And of course, there's no negative feedback for tamarisk growth because they don't have the insects and stuff that normally would chew on them, and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, the only time I've seen it really get controlled other than with herbicides is when you can have natural flooding conditions, because they don't really like to be flooded the same way that cottonwood willow native habitat does. Like, this big pulse will come through, clean everything out, and then the cottonwood willow can reestablish. But
So, well, off topic, but why don't we just pour Roundup like in?
well, yeah, I don't know. Something about
Seems like the right solution
Something
to
about
me.
chemicals dumped in water
just,
areas.
Just trust me, I think it'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, still on topic of nature and natural systems, probably a bunch of our listeners are like, talk about climate. There's so many. Come on. So, speaking of climate systems, there are a bunch of positive feedback loops that are happening that are amplifying our climate becoming destabilized. So the one that I think people often hear about is the albedo effect. So that's where basically when you have warming temperatures will melt ice and snow in cold regions. That ice and snow is reflecting a lot of sunlight back off into the atmosphere. When that's gone, it's warming temperatures. So you actually start getting oceans to be exposed. That warms the temperature even more. That melts more of that snow and ice. It just keeps amplifying, right?
Yeah. You have a polar ice cap that shrinks, and then next season it shrinks more because the ocean absorbed more heat. Yeah.
Or the permafrost starts to thaw, and so then you get this these bacteria start chewing on the now unfrozen biomass, and it releases methane because it's kind of an anaerobic condition where it's really wet still. So, and of course, methane's a greenhouse gas. There's another amplifying effect.
Yeah, and you get that in the ocean too. Like these, as they warm, you get methane bubbling up from the depths, and
you have it with drought, warmer temperatures drying out places, vegetation disappearing. That feeds to that climate being warmer and drier again. It just keeps escalating. So there's a lot of this happening with climate systems, and there's a lot of concern about some of these becoming runaway, right? And we can't influence them, can't control them.
Well, speaking of runaway implies things just happen really fast and go out of control.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you get like explosions, right? If you ever light a firecracker, the fuse starts a chemical reaction at one end and it just like ripples through, and the burning of the fuel on one side ignites the fuel as you go through it. And it happens so fast, it's an explosion. Same thing with like nuclear weapons and nuclear fuel in reactors. They can run away. It's these chain reactions, Those are all positive feedback loops that are just super quick.
I read that book, Chernobyl, which then got made into an HBO series. That is some harrowing stuff, I gotta say. But yeah, it talks a lot about the kind of runaway reaction.
And there's, back to human behavior and human systems, there's a lot of runaway stuff that happens in terms of human behavior. You think about asset bubbles, or on the flip side, runs on banks, right? So a stock gets hyped, people start buying it up. Other people are like, oh, I got to get in on this thing. They buy it too. That just keeps feeding on itself. The reverse happens, obviously, when you get these massive downturns in the stock market, or people start worrying about the safety of their money in the bank. Everyone runs to get their money out of the bank.
Yeah.
That just feeds on itself.
It's like your that shoebox full of Bitcoins that you've got in your closet.
Don't be telling people where it is, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many good examples of positive feedback loops. Sometimes I think that if you don't have a governor, or you don't have some kind of regulation or negative feedback loop in place, you can still get the same results that happen in a positive feedback loop. I know we've talked about my favorite Guinness Book of Records entry on Robert Wadlow, the tallest human who ever lived.
8'11", baby.
8'11". I know. I just love the idea of him like slam dunking basketballs without even stretching his arm out all the way. You know, like somehow if he were alive today and were healthy, he would just stand somewhere near the basket and just score at will. It would be awesome.
And the crazy thing about him is that he was, I think, still growing when he died.
Yeah. So he had no regulation in his pituitary gland of human growth hormone and just kept growing. So, I mean, it really doesn't matter what kind of system you look at. The feedback loops are really important in managing
right. In his case, he had no feedback loop at all, right? It was an open system, right? So there's nothing controlling. And thank God our bodies know how to do that.
Yeah. All the time there's feedback loops happening within our bodies that keep us in homeostasis.
Right. Well, so the reason I want to bring up positive feedback loops, in the context of Crazy Town is that we talked about it with like climate change, for example. Obviously, it's something that people think about in that context in terms of natural systems. But I think it's also important to think about it in terms of like human systems and the decisions that we're making that have brought us to this place and maybe influence how we get out of it or if we get out of it, right? So maybe an obvious one, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is thinking about political polarization. Okay. So if you think about this dynamic where, and we talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, like the conspiracy theory one, where people are only listening to certain information from certain people that they trust, right?
Yeah.
Because we have a politically divided, culturally divided society, that creates more extremes. They take on more extreme positions, or they see the other as like the enemy.
Yeah.
That makes that other, we're talking about people fighting, that makes the kind of the other side amp up their rhetoric, amp up their views.
Great example.
And it gets into a situation where it becomes about the fight.
Right.
You know what I mean? And more difficult to think about how to regulate, moderate, compromise, in a situation like that.
Again, we need a governor.
Well, we need a functioning governor.
Yeah. Well, I look at it also in the context of our entire, what's called built environment, all the infrastructure that's already out there that we've invested in. And the notion there is that our past investment really then determines what kind of levels of consumption we have to have today to get by. So if we've already invested in sort of freeway systems and suburban sprawl and giant houses with poor insulation, it's very hard for us to actually curtail our energy use and for society as a whole to curtail its necessary maintenance costs even. So you've locked yourself in other words, to the levels of energy and resource consumption going forward.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of like a self-reinforcing dynamic. And then all these next decisions you make are to double down on that. So I look at like the infrastructure plan of, the Democrats right now that they're working on. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is doubling down on, repairing all the stupid things we've already built.
Yeah. Well, you can see that. I mean, like if you have a town that's built around roads and driving and trucking products from here to there, it's not like the next town over can decide that it wants a monorail or a blimp network for its transportation system, right? I mean, it's just not going to fly if the whole matrix of the country is
to
roads.
Be connected and to everyone's got to have the same loading docks, for trucks. If you want to be a business that has a warehouse, you're locked into like accepting a certain way of shipping and receiving, and so all these things then interlock, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty cool point that you started here, Asher, with the idea that maybe positive feedback loops are behind a lot of things. Like I was thinking about the episode we recorded on specialization and complexity and how we're becoming more and more specialized. Well, that wording right there, more and more, can kind of clue you in there's a positive feedback loop there. Like think about it. I think we talked a little bit about how you can obviously get paid more if you're some kind of specialist in the economy that's in high demand. Well, if that's the case, then you kind of see universities start having more courses for specialization, and you get as you come out of that specialized education and get your specialized job, now you're dependent on other specialists to come into your life because you don't know how to do a damn thing.
Right. Yeah.
So it just it all builds on itself, and, and you've got another classic positive feedback loop.
Yeah. The world is so complicated now, so complex, as we said, that in order to get by, you need to hire all these other specialists so that you can even stay legal.
Right.
Yeah, and it reminds me of another episode that we had, another hidden driver we were talking about with, when we talked about cognitive biases. Both what you were saying, Jason, in terms of the built infrastructure investments there, and what you're just talking about with specialization and complexity, it's all that sunk cost.
Yeah, sunk cost bias, right.
And the fact that plays into it. But yeah, it's what you said, Rob. The reason I want to bring this up is because I would posit that maybe positive feedback loops are a hidden driver of a lot of the other hidden drivers that we've been talking about.
It's like hidden driver squared.
Yeah, it's the meta hidden driver.
Wow.
Deep thought. Yeah. But a friend of ours, Beth Sawin, who runs a group called Climate Interactive, she was a student or maybe a protege of Donella Meadows, who we've talked about before. Yeah.
Donella Meadows.
Who's just a great educator about systems thinking. And Beth has put together kind of this little online course to help people think more in systems when it comes to thinking about climate. And she said something great, which I thought was really important. And that is that reinforcing feedback, right? So positive feedback loops. Reinforcing feedback on its own is neither good nor bad, but it is a force for change. Reinforcing feedback can take system to new modes of behavior. And so I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of bad outcomes that come from positive feedback loops or reinforcing feedback in these systems, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
We could use it for good purposes as well. And especially when it comes to thinking about human, our behavior and trying to incentivize pro-social behavior versus behavior that sets us on this course towards crazy town.
Right. Well, I think it's really interesting when we started this conversation, one of the things that I came to realize, Jason, you and I were talking about how positive feedback loops, if they run for a long time, it tends to end badly.
Yeah.
Something bad happens that maybe even at some point you get out of the positive feedback loop because something big and bad enough happened to put an end to it.
Right.
But it seems like there's this turning point, and you really need to be aware of it because, like you're saying, Asher, a feedback loop, a positive one, can have a good result. But if you let it keep running, that result tends to turn sour. So I don't know. I think about the vaccination for COVID, for example. You get a shot, and your body starts, making its doing all of its chemical biological reactions. And you've kicked off a process. You've started something going, and you go get a booster shot, and it's a positive reinforcement. It makes your body go to the next level, and so that's a good thing. But it's not like you want to get 78 booster shots, and it'd probably overwhelm you and cause a mess, or either that or be totally ineffective.
Right.
So I don't know. There's some kind of wisdom in here about when to let a positive feedback run, but figure out when you might want to intervene to stop the eventual negative. I don't want to use positive negative to stop the eventual bad thing from
unwanted
happening.
Outcomes. Yeah. No, there's some really interesting dynamics at play potentially, and stories that we can keep going on. There was a recent study that I find kind of interesting because it kind of has good examples of all this stuff we're talking about, where you want to do something good. So the example they say is we want to get renewable energy scaled. And a great place to scale renewable energy is in deserts because we can put PV panels in deserts at just massive scales because no one's living there and land is cheap, and we're not
a lot of sunshine.
Yeah, we're not taking up farmland.
We should put them on Tatooine, where Luke Skywalker lives.
I think that the whole place.
I think Bezos is working on that. Right?
Yeah. Right. So anyway, folks were modeling, well, what if we just kept building out PV panels in the Sahara Desert? Now, I think there's a lot of problems to this with sand covering them and the fact these don't last forever and all the embedded energy of steel and concrete. It gets
Stop being such a realist.
It gets a little nutty, to be honest with you. But there's an interesting story. Like, let's pretend that nothing I normally care about is valid, but you do care about something else. Like, you care about the climate, right? And that's why you're doing this. So the study looked at, like, if you put so many solar panels in the desert, you change the albedo of the desert. And you talked about albedo earlier in the context of you melt glaciers or snow caps of the Arctic, and suddenly you change the albedo, where now
it doesn't want to have sex anymore.
Not libido. Like, I know you're worried about that. You're you're aging. But no, this is albedo. And it's reflectance. So what happens is that solar panels are dark. The desert tends to be light. Mm-hmm. So you add up to if you add 20% of the surface area of the Sahara.
If you cover it with solar panels,
you change the albedo so much that you change then the temperature of the atmosphere above the desert, and warm air rises. And when warm air rises, it draws in cold marine air, which is full of moisture. So suddenly what happens is you start getting a rainfall regime in the Sahara. Well, once you do that,
that kind of sucks for getting solar panels.
I know. Now you start shading them, right?
Yeah, but that's great for, now we've just got a beautiful vegetated desert.
Yes. So now you can actually create vegetation in the Sahara, which the Sahara, 5,000 years ago, Sahara had lakes and forests and everything, okay? But here's the key. The problem becomes the knock-on effects of what happens in the Amazon. The Amazon apparently goes bye-bye when you do that because it relies on dust from the Sahara carrying across the ocean, seeding clouds, and also fertilizing the Amazon basin. So you destroy the Amazon by trying to create solar panels in the desert to a certain threshold.
Now that's assuming we haven't already bulldozed it completely anyway, or slash and burned it.
That's an argument for why we should just cut down all the trees right now.
Just do it. Just get ahead of the curve.
Right. No, I think I think that's a really important point, which is to recognize these system dynamics that happen that may be invisible to us, the consequences we don't necessarily see. But if you think in systems and you start thinking about the different inputs and the dynamics interactivity between them, you might say, oh my God, if we do this thing, we up this, factor over here that creates this cascading effect, where you might get this positive feedback loop that could end up generating an outcome that is the opposite of what you had intended. Right. And so I think it's important to recognize this sort of invisible force of these positive feedback loops, and also think carefully when we're trying to intervene to what, as you had said, Rob, to use those dynamics in good ways. I'm trying not to use the word positive, in good ways, but be very careful about going too far in a sense.
So this is what I just heard you say. Don't say A to some guy in Philadelphia on the street.
The soccer sucks as a sport, right? Are you coming over here? You want to do something?
Thanks, guys, for reducing it to nothing.
You bring it. Put the baseball bat down, all right?
I'm going to take my dog
I'm turning this off and I'm leaving. Stay tuned for our George Costanza Memorial Do the Opposite segment, where we discuss things we can do to get the hell out of Crazy Town.
You don't have to just listen to the three of us blather on anymore.
We've actually invited someone intelligent on the program to provide inspiration. Hey guys, I got a short and sweet review that I want to share with you this week. This comes in from Jeff, who says about our podcast, "These are the environmental conversations we need to be having. A pure dose of reality."
Excellent. Well, like a dose of what?
Well, it's better than a dose
Dark
of
reality.
methamphetamines.
Okay.
It's probably better than a dose of your own medicine. No, sorry, that's taste of your own medicine.
I mean, reality dosing. I think that's a good term.
Well,
We're reality dosers.
sweet, yes. Well, I just want to say thanks to Jeff, and please, anyone else out there that has any liking for this show, get out there on iTunes or wherever you can rate and review.
Please, we like it when people like us.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
So if we're going to be like our good buddy George Costanza and do the opposite, the way I think about this is that we need to change the way we see the world as we walk through it. So you think about, at least in my case, I think very simply about things, or tend to, like, oh, there's something over there, this causes that, kind of end of story. There's no real understanding that there's a system over there. Like if I'm looking at a forest, it functions as a system. There's feedback loops, both negative and positive, that affect it. And to really understand what's going on, I need to understand what those feedback loops are. Now, I'm kind of saying that I don't tend to think that way very well, and I've been reading and trying to learn about this kind of thinking for a while. And
On your own, because it's not like you're taught this in school.
yeah,
right?
that's one of the points that you never see it unless you're in that field we talked about, cybernetics, or you're a systems engineer.
Or an ecologist.
Ecologist, yeah.
Ecology, yeah. In fact, I think that's why so many ecologists, when they delve into economics, that's the main fundamental flaw that they expose. It's like economists aren't thinking in systems. They're thinking very linearly. So to do the opposite, we really need to kind of take on that self-study and learn to see the world in systems and learn to understand where those feedback loops are. And a couple of resources that are useful, probably the most famous would be Donella Meadows' book, which is called Thinking in Systems, a Primer. And I've read it. It takes some effort because she talks about how to diagram out a system, and it's not like super intuitive. I mean, the book's well written, of course, and has good lessons, but you have to work at it. Another one, as Cher, you already mentioned, was a course at Climate Interactive called Climate Leader, and it's got a major kind of systems recognition component, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the main first step of doing the opposite, is try to see the world in systems and recognize what's happening.
Yeah, and when I see the world in systems, I see these runaway positive feedback loops that scare me, right? Because they go on, but they end up ending, and they might end very badly. So we talked about all that from the climate system, and of course, economic growth as a process, and our built environment, and our dependency on just getting more and more resources. So the analogy I think about is figuring out a way to sort of slow down that runaway or stop that runaway feedback loop. And we do this in like nuclear power reactors, where you can have a runaway reaction that leads to a meltdown. But to prevent that, you take these control rods, they're called, and they're these substances that absorb neutrons. So the neutron reaction doesn't just go so fast that it causes a blow up or meltdown.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like we need to figure out how to intervene in our own socioeconomic systems in ways that prevent sort of the runaway positive feedback
Can
problem.
we just jam a control rod into the economy?
Yes, we need to jam control rods.
I could think of a few people I'd want to ram a control rod into.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to know what that means exactly. It would be kind of cool if you had a universal control rod that could stop any positive feedback loop.
You're like, oh, need one over there.
Yeah, it's designing for that. It's also maybe taking a precautionary principle. You were talking about that with solar panels in the Sahara Desert.
Yeah.
Just not to say don't do anything at all. It's just thinking through the system dynamics and saying, well, maybe we should think about doing this differently, or maybe these things we shouldn't do. A lot of people talk about that with geoengineering.
Right.
Right? Like, talking about taking risks without really understanding the system dynamics, you could get a runaway positive feedback loop that we had no idea would happen. Right?
Really good example of why you want to see the world in systems rather than, here's a problem. Just throw some particles in the air and that'll solve it.
Let's throw iron in the ocean.
There's overpopulation. Let's just shoot people into space.
Right.
And thinking about what Beth was talking about with system dynamics and positive feedback loops, when she said that reinforcing feedback can take systems to new modes of behavior, I think that's really true. And so there's another way I think we could think about doing the opposite and for all of us to engage with this dynamic of positive feedback loops, and that is modeling behavior and trying to, in a sense, create a dynamic where it kind of cascades and builds. And
it's like a desirable positive feedback loop that changes the system in a way you want, rather than I was giving examples of ways we don't want.
Yeah, and a small example of that, but it was really meaningful to me is, years ago when my wife and I bought our first home, it had a little lawn in the front, and we were on a little suburban street.
Wow, how American.
Yeah, I felt so American. I had a flag out and everything. And all our neighbors had lawns too. And we decided, my wife was a school garden teacher. We ripped out the lawn in the front and planted native plants. And it was really interesting to see. It wasn't necessarily our intention to begin with, but we started, we had neighbors asking us about it. And again, it was one of those situations where it was a positive feedback loop in the sense that we were also going through drought. Right. And so people were recognizing, can't use so much water, lawns are dying out. They see an example of another lawn that used very little water. So other neighbors started ripping out their lawns and planting. And the more neighbors did it, the more neighbors did it. So it got to the point where more than half, I would say, maybe considerably more than half of our neighbors on our block had ripped out their lawns and had put in these beautiful
No control rod needed there, baby.
Nope.
I don't know, though. That makes me think you're a communist or something.
Individual initiative, but in a good viral
If I was a communist, I would have forced everyone off of their property, sent them somewhere else.
And then demanded that they...
Industrial...
Anybody that doesn't push a lawnmower every Sunday has got to be a communist.
That's okay. That's me. You got me. Elizabeth Sawin is a co-founder and co-director of Climate Interactive, an independent nonprofit think tank that employs a long tradition of system dynamics modeling to create simulations and insights that help people see connections, play out scenarios, and see what works to address climate change, inequity, and related issues like energy, health, and food. She's also an expert on systems thinking, going back to her early days working with the late Donella Meadows, which is really why I wanted to invite you to talk with us today, Beth. Thanks for joining us in Crazy Town.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
So on this season of the podcast, we're talking about hidden drivers that are moving us to the precipice of environmental and social breakdown, or ones that are keeping us from acting collectively in ways that actually help. In this episode, Rob, Jason, and I talked about positive feedback loops, or what sometimes people call reinforcing feedback, that serves in some ways like a hidden driver behind many of the other hidden drivers that we've talked about on the podcast. So I wanted to talk to you because you teach systems thinking. It's something that I've found particularly difficult to know how to help people in layman terms employ. And I know you've done a lot of work on that. And you've actually developed an online course called The Climate Leader, which we'll link to in the show notes, where you talk about positive feedback loops or reinforcing feedback. So I just want to start by asking kind of an open-ended question, which is, for our listeners who are starting to think more about the role that reinforcing feedback loops or positive feedback loops play in kind of the pickle that we're in, are there suggestions that you have to help them be better systems thinkers or kind of recognize those dynamics more?
Yeah, great question. I mean, in all the issues that we face, reinforcing feedback shows up in at least two ways, right? On the one hand, like you're saying, in terms of drivers. So reinforcing feedback processes where change feeds upon itself and a little change leads to more change in the same direction. We recognize that, say, in economic growth, in the physical capital of the global economy, which grows exponentially by design, right? And we know that from that comes greenhouse gas emissions and water withdrawals from aquifers and pressure on forests and all the rest of it. So the problems that we're facing are growing exponentially. That means they're growing by reinforcing feedback. And probably in the prior part of your show, you talked about how that can fool our intuition. Was that something that you went into?
No, not so much, actually.
Yeah. Well, my teacher, you mentioned Danella Meadows, and she and my other systems thinking teachers were really strong and clear on this, that any process where things double tends to have a behavior. Sometimes it's called the hockey stick, right? If you were to graph it, it looks like very, very slow change and then suddenly an explosion, right? And if you're not looking for the signature of reinforcing feedback, you don't notice how dangerous things are until, the very last doubling, which pushes something critical over a limit or over a threshold. And so part of why our economic and political systems are so ineffective at responding to our problems is that they're not always grappling with just that mathematics of exponential growth.
Yeah. The pandemic, I feel like, helped people understand the dynamic of exponential growth a little bit. Like in the early days, I remember seeing lots of people commenting on sort of the dynamic of the spread.
Yeah, right. And we learned flatten the curve. We learned that you have to act in a way that seems disproportionate to where you are at the moment, right? Like the best public health response looks like an overreaction to the current situation. And that's because the public health officials are totally clear about exponential growth. And they know that in one more doubling, which with COVID is 2 weeks or 14 days or so, a system that's working fine now could be overwhelmed. Well, it's the exact same thing for climate change, right? An emergency response capacity that's working okay now in one more doubling could be overwhelmed. And the challenge is our coping capacities don't grow exponentially, right? The number of doctors and hospital beds doesn't double, even while the number of patients is doubling. The amount of an economy available to build seawalls doesn't grow exponentially just because the threat might be growing exponentially.
Yeah, although we could have a whole conversation about money. Money is the one area where it feels like, and we're seeing now with sort of government policy, that you could decide that you're going to spend a lot of money. It turns out that it's actually doing things in the real world, which can't grow exponentially. But in terms of the money supply, you could do that pretty quickly.
Yeah, but I would draw people's attention to coping capacity, which has other limits besides money. It has how fast can you train people? How quickly can you learn and adapt? And money maybe can help some of that, but not all of it.
So you're just talking about how it's kind of like difficult to recognize these dynamics until you hit that point where the hockey stick, it becomes clearly visible, which in some ways is almost like too late in a dynamic, right?
Yeah. Yep. And here's a sort of ironic thing, which is if you flip that, the same type of mathematics is there for our social movements, right? Which are also growing via reinforcing feedback. Anytime one person goes to a protest or a educational event and has a change of heart and they bring two friends back, that's feeding an exponential growth process, right? And so that's going to have the same math, which is going to look like very, very slow change, flat, nothing happening, explosion of numbers and power and people who are persuaded. And so what happens as problems grow exponentially, we sort of react too late, or that's the danger. When our solutions are growing exponentially, the danger is we give up too early. Right? We don't understand that we're actually in the flat part of exponential growth. And really what we need to do, what's called for, is just to keep going, to keep feeding those cycles, because the potential for that explosion of new thinking or newly engaged people could be right around the next doubling.
Yeah, I want to unpack that a little bit. So just getting back to the pandemic, and you're talking about people in the health sector sort of, they understand those dynamics and they're trying to get ahead of them. There's that risk that happens where people have a backlash against the preventative measures that we've taken because they actually were successful. And therefore, then people think this was unnecessary, right? And And you're talking in some ways about the flip side of that, which is we give up too soon on strategies that we might employ because we're not seeing the impacts of them happening quite yet.
Yeah. And so I think for people who are leading change strategies that have some element of reinforcing feedback, what I encourage people to look for is more change in the right direction than breakthrough that we actually completely solved whatever this issue is that we're working on. So if you're working on a movement, are your numbers growing? Then you're going in the right direction and keep doing it. And then I encourage people to really think about, and often you can just sketch this on a piece of paper, explicitly what is the feedback loop that's part of your change strategy. So if you're building a movement, your change strategy has some amount of thinking that the more people who are involved, the more new people who we will involve, the more people who are involved, the more new people, right? That's how you build that exponential growth. And so you need to look at every chain in that circle and make sure you're attending to it. And so you might have great numbers, but if you haven't thought about, do we have the capacity to handle an increase in our numbers? Like what's our method for orienting new members and making people feel welcome? If we don't attend to that, we're starving our potential for reinforcing feedback. And instead we're having just linear feedback, right? It won't grow, or linear lack of feedback. It won't feed upon itself.
Right.
So sometimes a strategy that might work at an early stage of exponential growth might, have a limitation later unless you've planned for it. The other thing people talk about is the technical term is the gain around the exponential loop. So how strong is it? And there, an idea that comes from communications applies to lots of other things, which is the stickiness. So if you have a new idea that's growing, say, by word of mouth, people are like, I heard this cool new thing. And then, they tell a friend and a friend tells a friend. So their stickiness is like, how captivating is the idea? How memorable is it? How easy is it for someone to share? And so maybe you have a train the trainer program. You have to think about not just how to train the trainers, but how to train them in a way that they can train the next trainers. And so it starts to be 2 or 3 cycles out. Are these materials sticky? The stickier they are, the more advantage you'll get around those cycles of reinforcing feedback.
Sounds like you're recommending a lot of intentionality and trying to recognize the work that people are trying to do as being part of a system, trying to figure out where you were talking about looking at each element in a sense in that system and making sure that it's not set up in a way where you're talking about capacity, where the capacity is not limited if you're actually successful in getting reinforcing feedback and exponential growth. Are there tools that you suggest? I mean, should we direct people to the Climate Leader course as a place to sort of help people think more about how to think in systems in that way?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a free resource that we have at Climate Interactive. Although it's focused for leaders in climate change, the ideas really could be applied to any type of social movement or change movement. And it's a series of short videos and supporting material that's sort of our offering at Climate Interactive of what we were taught in terms of systems thinking by our mentors, trying to make it just available for people doing this work. And yeah, I really recommend really holding your strategies up to the light of systems thinking if possible. I mean, our movements are under-resourced, we're outnumbered, we're overspent in many cases. And like we said at the beginning, we're up against problems that are growing exponentially. So unless we have good strategies that tap exponential growth in our response, we won't be able to catch up would be my thinking or my argument for why, even though it seems really urgent and you want to just be out doing the work, why now and then taking a step back and framing it in systems is worth doing. If you're a reader rather than a video course doer, I think one of the best books is by my mentor, Danella Meadows, called Thinking in Systems, that breaks down a lot of this as well.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing maybe I would add to that is, for folks listening, maybe you're not somebody who is trying to mobilize people. That's not your role necessarily. Maybe your role is trying to develop alternatives to the current economic system, food system, whatever it is that we have. Maybe the challenge there is to think about how to tap that innovation that you're working on with other systems so that people can learn from it, right? So your role doesn't need to be a proselytizer, let's say, but connecting with others who are able to disseminate that knowledge or that inspiration so that others can pick it up, I think is also really, really valuable.
Yeah. And, another set of key reinforcing feedback loops that are at play right now are technological ones, where the barriers to clean technologies, especially price, is just improving so much, right? So that's a reinforcing feedback loop where the more installed capacity there is of a new technology, the more economies of scale, the more familiarity people have with it, the more the price falls, which opens it to new markets where people couldn't imagine engaging with it, which it opens up even more economies of scale. So there's that same flavor of the more change you have, the more change you get in the same direction. That's the hallmark of reinforcing feedback. And it's not only about social movements at all. Sure. It's about innovation and change. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful. I really appreciate it. And I think our listeners will appreciate it as well. Thanks so much, Beth. And thanks for all your work with Climate Interactive.
Yeah. Great. Good luck with everything. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Crazy Town.
Yeah, if by some miracle you actually got something out of it, please take a minute and give us a positive rating or leave a review at your preferred podcast app.
And thanks to all our listeners, supporters, and volunteers. And special thanks to our producer, Melody Travers.
Okay, guys, you guys are all familiar with this expression, spare the rod, spoil the child.
Yeah.
Sounds a little harsh.
It is, and so...
how I live my life.
Well, that's the problem. Nowadays it's often not legal to beat your children into submission, right? It's just not. And so to stay out of jail, modern parents need other ways to keep the peace in these overwrought, COVID-restricted households we've got, where the kids are continually squabbling, and you have to have some important business meeting on Zoom. So what are you going to do? Neck wringing and muzzles are off the table. And so this is a situation where our sponsor, today's sponsor, is perfect. It's called the Home Control Rod. And it's just made for this. You just march into any situation in your home that's driving you fucking bonkers and up the wall, all right? You march in with the Home Control Rod. You just clasp this puppy in two hands, firmly, strike it on the floor, and it will immediately glow in a blinding light and hum like a fucking cathedral organ.
Do you have to yell, "You shall not pass"?
Well, this is the thing, okay? It will turn your voice into the voice of freaking God. And so it brings ultimate authority to the situation. It puts the little fuckers in their place, terrified and silent for at least 30 minutes. Guaranteed or your money back.
Well,
so this is like Moses' staff. You're basically like...
Yeah, Gandalf, whatever you want.
Right, parting the seas. In this case, it's shutting up the lips.
Yes.
Look, regardless of whether you support this this sponsor or not, at least we know that neck wringing is off the table. So that's a good public service announcement.
Hey,
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, it's an alternative.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.